Okay. Morning, good afternoon to all of you, sorry.
Maybe let's just give it a couple of minutes so that more people join, because Zoom takes a little bit. I think we can start now.
We can start now? Okay, with a good number of participants. So good afternoon to all of you. My name is Cécile Lagout. I'm program manager here at DCAF, DCAF Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance. Within the MENA division, it's a real pleasure for me to welcome you all for the launch event of this publication, The Road to Stability, Rethinking Security Sector Reform in Post-Conflict Libya, a publication that I actually strongly recommend you to read, for it provides a very interesting and deep insight on the current state and challenges regarding security sector reform in Libya, and more broadly on security sector reform in fragile context. So first of all, I'd like to start with a couple of words on logistic. First, to tell you that simultaneous interpretation is available, is provided through Zoom with the button here, interpretation from English and to English and Arabic. للترجمة باللغة العربية لغته على الكورية. And the second point is that we will have a Q&A period in the second part of this launch event, but please submit your question through the Q&A feature rather than in the chat. So before we start, I'd like to introduce you to Mr. Andrea Cellino. Mr. Andrea Cellino is a principal lead program manager and head of North Africa desk at DCAF. Well, he's known by many of you, and has an extended experience in North Africa, in particular on oversight and issues. Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Cecile. It's a pleasure and an honor, other than a privilege for me to say a few words to open this event, which, as you all know, is dedicated to launching the publication, The Road to Stability, Rethinking Security Sector Reform in Post-Conflict Libya, a publication which has been brilliantly edited by my colleagues Archibald Gallet, Emadeddin Badi, and Roberta Maggi. This publication was born out of DCAF, out of our intent to offer unique expertise and insights regarding SSR in Libya and in general in context of fragility, conflict, and violence. Indeed, it responds to an urgent need, or we believe it responds to an urgent need to support efforts to stabilize the country, given the partial success in establishing a unified executive authority in 2021. Of course, there are still many uncertainties, but we hope that both Libya's authoritarian political past and the aftermath of the 2011 violent overthrow of the Qaddafi regime, as they contributed to the hybridization and fragmentation of the security sector and lack of political legitimacy, which is normally a key component of successful DDR, or disarmament, demobilization and reintegration, and SSR efforts. As I said, we hope that all the chapters included in this volume will provide interesting insights to make this reality and to make sense of this reality and reflect on the ways forward towards reform and stability in Libya, despite the evident challenge they are faced by all Libyans in the first place. This is, I should say, from an institutional point of view, is part of a broader editorial endeavor, which began last year with a publication of Exploring Armed Groups in Libya, Perspectives on SSR and in an Hybrid Environment by Emadeddin Badi, which is still very much, offers still very much valuable perspectives. But these volumes features contributions of some key thematic experts on various facets of hybridity in conflict environments in the continuum between SSR and DDR. It is really with great pleasure that I see gathered around my screen some, or at least almost all of the prominent expert, or the most prominent expert on SSR in Libya, whose excellent contributions we really are proud to feature in this volume. I just to name them and thank them, then Cécile will provide for more extended introduction, but I really wish to thank Herbert, Tarek, Megerisi, Inga Cristina Trauti, who sadly is not with us today, but she will be available to reply to any question through DCAF, and Frederic Wehrey, and of course, my colleagues, Emadeddin Badi and Archibald Gallet and Roberta Maggi. Finally, I would like to thank the donors of the Trust Fund for North Africa, the TFNA as we call it, for their continuous support to DCAF's work in North Africa and in particular in Libya, and of course also of this edited volume. So now enough for the introduction. I leave the floor to Cécile and I ask her kindly to take the lead and introducing properly all our distinguished panelists, and of course kick off the discussion, because that's what everybody is tuned in to listen. So thank you again to all of you for being here with us today. And Cécile, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrea. So we will present now the first chapter, Security Sector Stabilization, Defining a Path in the Libyan Context. And for that, I will leave the floor first to my colleague Archibald Gallet, who's Program Manager of the Libya Program at DCAF, following an extended experience with several organizations. Archibald, you may please introduce us to the rationale of this edited volume and explain how this volume fits within the broader context of what DCAF does in Libya, and also from your analysis of the concept of security sector stabilization as a subset of SSR, what insight could be drawn in particular in terms of creating the condition requested for security and stability. Archibald, please.
Thank you, Cécile, and thank you very much for having me here. I'm glad to see so many distinguished experts and practitioners on Libya and beyond to be connected with us. So in a nutshell, I want to explain why we chose these topics, why we've been doing this edited volume altogether. As you know, DCAF is not a think tank per se, but we are a Swiss foundation whose work is to develop and implement SSR and SSG programs. However, we also do develop doctrine about these topics, if only because we have access to this very specific material, but also because, of course, as you know, SSR remains a crucial topic, a central topic in the current conversation towards Libya stabilization and future reform. In Libya, on the top of this research and policy agenda that we have and whose offspring you just see right now, we also support security providers in developing their capacity And we work at the local level with institutions and civil society, notably on community policing issues, but also to try to restore local dialogue. We support access to justice by making relevant laws available to the wider public. And we try and facilitate access to reliable information, notably in supporting the media in gaining capacity to cover security-related topics, something that we have done in the very recent past. So all this hands-on experience drove us to somehow to challenge the traditional doctrine of SSR, notably in adapting it to the conflict countries, in conflict countries. We noticed that the bulk of the theory around SSR, notably for historical reasons, I would say, is focused on post-conflict and transition countries. And it doesn't really apply to the current context in Libya. Therefore, as you know, we worked on hybridity last year, and this year we expanded in working on specific topics relevant to today's Libya: the resources, the elections, the security of extractives. But we also wanted to take stock of past initiatives in matters of SSR. For the vast majority, didn't have enough impact on the security architecture of the country. And as a consequence, we question, in this edited volume, the intellectual framework in which such policies were designed, I guess. So this is where I can answer your second question about security sector stabilization. It came from observing the situation in detail, as I said, but also discussing with experts in other parts of the world who are working in fragile states, and we came to two conclusions. I'm going to be a bit provocative here, but I think that having traditional SSR programs is not really possible during conflict for several reasons. First, because SSR is a very long-term endeavor. It takes a generation minimum. We see it from other places. And you can always come with like betterment of your security architecture. So it's like an everlasting effort. It's always perfectible. It is also intertwined with the construction of a democratic state and the development of good governance mechanisms. It requires a mentality shift for the regime that has to stop to protect itself against the others, to adopt a population-centered approach. And then it gradually builds up during a dialogue between civil society and the authorities. And it goes through development of rule of law, notably. And the second conclusion that we saw is that too often, within this framework, keeping that in mind, we witness that train and equip programs or very minor shifting of responsibilities within the ministry is portrayed as SSR in Libya. I guess it might sound fancy for donors, bilateral actors. It makes bilateral cooperation look more legitimate, but it actually dismisses what are the essentials of real SSR: rule of law, population-centered, transparency, civilian oversight, to say the main ones. So with, keeping in mind that basically what was happening was not real SSR, we said what should be done, what could we do in such circumstances. And doing some research, I came across these reflections of the United Kingdom Stab Unit during the times of the transformation wars of Iraq and Afghanistan. Totally different context, I do agree. But they came with a security sector stabilization concept, which is like something that, I found meaningful, because it helps to frame the pre-SSR efforts in a meaningful way, with the intent of preserving the possibilities of proper SSR to take place when the time is right. As regards to definition, I think that SSS is like a pre-SSR effort with conflict sensitivity. We want to keep in mind the long-term impact of interim security arrangements in the long-term architecture of security forces and security arrangements. What it means is that when you are in a pre-stabilization phase, all the decisions that you make towards the security architecture, towards security actors, are going to have very deep effects on the longer term. And interim security arrangements, confidence building measures will be part of a longer term security architectures that will last likely to last like for several years, even like decades in certain cases. So what we want to highlight is that basically in drafting these decisions, you have to keep in mind that they will affect significantly the longer term SSR. So that's basically in a nutshell what I can introduce. And of course, I benefited a lot from Emad's experience in matters of local situation and how it would decline specifically in the Libyan context. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'd actually be really interested to hear more from the second author of this first chapter, Mr. Emadeddin Badi, who's advisor for Libya within DCAF and also affiliates as a researcher to several organizations. Emad, you might precise what are the possible prospects for SSR plans and more precisely, the implications of the ceasefire agreement in Libya, also within the context of the formation of a unified executive authority in Tripoli, the GNU, or Government of National Unity, with security sector stabilization in mind. Please, Ahmed.
Yep. Can you hear me all right, by the way?
Yeah.
All right, perfect. Thank you. So thank you, Cecile, for the introduction. Thank you for the great questions. And I would like to extend my thanks to all the authors, DCAF, obviously, and my co-author for this particular chapter and co-editor of the volume, Archie, and also Roberta. In terms of the actual chapter and also the broader volume, let me try and situate it a little bit and also explain that will also in turn answer a bit the question. As Archie mentioned, we had a discussion late last year about kind of framing security sector reform, acknowledging the hybrid landscape, and this effort builds on that publication and the engagement with all the authors present here and other people that we've also engaged with and organizations over the past year. Now, obviously, Libya has also changed in the past year. There's a new government. There was a ceasefire that was announced. There's a process, or let's say enthusiasm towards security sector reform that was witnessed earlier this year or late last year with the signing of the ceasefire and the arrival of the Government of National Unity. But I think where we might have seen a bit of a, I won't say a failure, but a bit of failure to, let's say, translate that enthusiasm into actual policy is because of the gap that Archie mentioned about actually how to deal with a conflict context and the fact that, well, traditional security sector reform blueprint in a hybrid environment aren't really workable. So we decided to kind of look at what was going on in Libya, look at the ceasefire agreement, look at the actual, let's say, situation politically, militarily, and also the prospects of the political process itself with the impending elections, and figure out how to translate, let's say, that enthusiasm for stabilization, for security sector reform into something that is operational. And that's the, let's say, entire premise of this volume, is it's intended to be an operational thing aside the doctrinal facets that Archie mentioned in terms of security sector stabilization. So when looking at the ceasefire agreement, we noticed several things where, first of all, it was paving the way towards elections, which had its own set of kind of, I would say, prerequisites in terms of what was supposed to be achieved before that. There were also other clauses that related to kind of the ceasefire monitoring mechanism and also a momentum towards stabilization, I would say, that with the arrival of this government in terms of it being able to secure or restabilize the, for instance, electrical grid, the water pipelines, etc. And that's the chapters that both Matthew Herbert and Tarek Megerisi tackled quite excellently, I would say. And there was also the idea of that, well, under what doctrine would this all be, I would say, deployed? And that's where the security sector stabilization doctrine comes from. And we tried to introduce in the chapter introductory, I would say, ideas as to how this would work out in practice, with a focus particularly, for instance, on the city of Ssr, where the ceasefire is, well, let's say where the ceasefire has, or the stalemate, let's call it, has been prevalent over the past year, and where at least there was supposed to be a security sector reform process that was kickstarted. Now, the good thing I would say about this chapter is, or the entirety of the volume, is it's not, I wouldn't say it's conditional upon the political process, and we make it very clear that the political process shouldn't be viewed as kind of the contingent factor in terms of kickstarting a security sector reform process. So we don't need to wait until elections happen, but we need to actually time things accordingly. So I won't say that the chapter has now become irrelevant because the electoral question is kind of hanging in the balance or all of that. I would say that you need to further innovate based on the ideas that are present, that we have in the chapter about, well, what the entry points for security sector reform are, how to reform the police, what the focus should be in terms of actual DDR and SSR processes. And this is where the chapter of Frederic Wehrey is also particularly useful in terms of that, in terms of the fact that, well, this is all not unfolding in a vacuum. There were lessons learned from the past 10 years in several attempts, whether actually launched or kind of brainstorming plans to actually introduce security sector reform and DDR processes that either failed or had minor successes. And he also builds on those to highlight, well, what does this mean for the contemporary reality? But overall, I would say that, well, for those that are listening, try to read it. We're open to have feedback on it as well, and we're also open to cooperate with other perhaps organizations and researchers on actually building on these ideas for next year as well. Basically, I'll leave it at that. Maybe we can answer more in the Q&A phase.
Thank you. Well, thanks to both of you actually for shedding the light on this concept of security sector stabilization, and also what it could bring in terms of theoretical and operational perspective. I will now give the floor to Mr. Tarek Megerisi, since he has unfortunately to leave earlier than expected. Mr. Megerisi is a senior policy fellow for North Africa and Middle East at the European Council on Foreign Relations. He authored a chapter on restoring electricity and water services in post-conflict Libya. So Tarek, what are the insights that your analysis on the restoration of essential services such as water, electricity provide into Libya's political and security spheres? And so what's the impact that hybridity have on the security sector capabilities to stabilize the access to those vital services and to ensure the due protection and the infrastructure? And also what is really interesting in your chapter, the link that you made with the international community's understanding of people-centered approaches to security provision. So what this would fit with the with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cecile, and thank you to DCAF for inviting me to be here today and to take part in what's been a really great experience and publication. Yeah, you went straight to the bone there. Some quite incisive questions, but I mean, just to try and break it down, overall, I think it shows that you know, both Libya's political and security spheres remain, I mean, frankly speaking, extremely parochial, and unfortunately, they do remain also mired in corruption. And you know, I'm thanking Archibald here for taking or establishing the precedent to be provocative here, because I think we do need to be frank and provocative to really get to any real insights. But you know, these lingering approaches prevent any real systemic attempt to cohere strategic long-term responses to many key issues of the state, like restoring electricity and water services. But more than that, you know, this parochialism this narrow focus also means that the competent people who are engaged in these issues and who are kind of struggling desperately to, well, in this case, to quite literally keep their lights on, never actually become really empowered to do their jobs better. Instead, the opposite happens. You know, their lives are actually made worse by this myopia, by the general incompetence of those who are managing them or who have the political positions above them, and this incessant need within the Libyan state system to make everything that is state-owned about personal status, about personal power, and kind of growing patronage networks out. But if we go from that kind of high level of abstraction over to the hybridity issue, I think that hybridity is essentially another expression of these very same problems, whereby the formalization of what were basically informal actors, average people without any of the necessary skills to be doing the job of their new roles, no real professional obligations upon them or leverage by any other actor over them. This blank professionalization that they've been given means that there is no real incentivization for them to engage, to get their hands dirty, and to do what is actually a very complicated and very difficult job of stabilization here. But in terms of protection and the security aspect, it's actually a bit more interesting, because if we look at the issue of Libya's infrastructure, the country is just geographically so big, and Libya's infrastructure is so spread out that it's really impossible to guard in any centralized system or any traditional sense of the term, because there are just too many sites and too many places that you just don't have the manpower to do it. So that means that a sense of local ownership and local protectionism is actually necessary to really have a real useful or workable security approach here. The challenge becomes, about how to incentivize these local groups to then see the national need, see the bigger picture, and to buy into the need to protect infrastructure rather than to predate upon it. And this hybridity, it also kind of confuses the international response, because international engagement or interfacing with other countries is kind of predicated on these very traditional institution to institution engagement, or these very set and formulaic models that we all work off. Also almost like a cookie cutter approach, which just isn't really that relevant to the Libyan scenario and the hybridity of the sector. So saying that, these more modern holistic approaches to security provision, whereby the interconnectivity of security with politics, with social issues, and so on is I think really the key here. It's understanding how messed up everything is together, and how interwoven everything is. And so what we need to do really in order to make this work is to build a sense of local ownership, to return a sense of the national, and to return a certain realism to how we engage with these sectors. And even from the point of view of the senior strata of Libyan politicians here, there's a certain kind of infantilizing of the Libyan population for political reasons or for quick wins, which really isn't necessary here, and it's actually destructive in the longer term. What we need to be doing is to find the tools and the mechanisms to empower the right people instead of politicizing every aspect, and to get these politicians, whether they're in the GNU or whatever replaces it after the elections, to then communicate better with the wider population in order to get that public buy-in, and to move from seeking to make short-term gains from just claiming that they can do things like rapidly return stable electricity because they know it's a popular thing to say, even though it's impossible, to actually starting to make the long-term plans that are needed to restore services in a sustainable and effective way, and to actually get the Libyan public buy-in by engaging with them, by communicating with them, by showing these plans and these strategies, and adding more transparency to the mix, which to end as I began on a provocative note might be quite a long stretch for the broader system, which tends towards opacity rather than transparency. But thank you very much again, and my sincere apologies that I do have to leave early. It's this pain of traveling in the era of COVID. But thank you so much for inviting me to be here again.
Thank you so much, Tarek. Well, actually, you've perfectly underlined the interconnectivity of those issues and the intricacy between well, the economy and politics and security and human, and pointed out the importance of human security and the need for a more comprehensive and holistic approach. So thank you, really. We will now give the floor to Mr. Frederic Wehrey, who's a senior fellow in the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a renowned expert on Libya and SSR. The title of the chapter that he wrote, The Lost Decades, DDR and SSR Lessons in Libya, I think speaks for itself. These lost years. Frederic, how would you summarize the main shortcomings of the SSR and DDR program that were operationalized in Libya since 2011? What would you recommend? What would be the recommendation that you could provide for SSR and DDR practitioners in terms of the continuum between SSR and DDR and the sequencing of those efforts?
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for those questions, and thanks again to the DCAF team for inviting me to participate in this great volume. And yeah, really thrilled to be alongside such esteemed contributors. Yeah, my task was to extract lessons learned from the past, and I think this is really critical because there's often a lot of personnel turnover in officials, diplomats that come to the Libya file. They're well-meaning, they want to start new initiatives, but they often don't realize that some of these things were tried before. So my task was to really go through this past decade, which I do term as a lost decade, because I do think there were a lot of missteps and missed opportunities, and draw lessons learned. So I think the first starting point is we have to account for the legacy of the Qaddafi era. And of course, we all know what he did to the security sector, the hollowing out, the centralization, but that's not the whole story. We can't say that it was predetermined because of his rule. We have to look at the agency of Libyans themselves after the revolution, and also outsiders. And I think obviously after the overthrow of Qaddafi, there were a number of preconditions for SSR that were missing. These include an inclusive political transition, input and involvement from civil society, coordination among different foreign actors and donors, local governance capacity, the integration of financial, technical, and economic tools. And so, in the absence of these conditions, there's been a lot of ill-advised short-term DDR and SSR efforts that have often made things worse. These initiatives have been instrumentalized by competing elites in Libya, and the security sector has really become a zero-sum game for factional, contestation. And of course, the political economy aspect of this is a large part of the equation, the oil wealth. The result, of course, was the capture of entire ministries, security organs by different factions, the development of parallel security organs that were often framed as interim, existing alongside the formal bodies, but they were really vehicles for, patronage and factional supremacy. In many cases, as you mentioned, the functions of DDR and SSR were blurred. So there were attempts to implement very early on DDR as sort of a technocratic technical process, a jobs program, without an assessment of Libya's security governance needs in terms of the personnel size, the force structure, and more importantly, before there was a political consensus, right? We didn't understand that DDR is inherently a political act, right? Surrendering your weapons. And so it's not simply a an economic function. And so I think, there were other problems where SSR was often seen as something to address insecurity. We've got violence, let's implement SSR to stop the violence through a train and equip program. And I'll go through some of the disastrous results of that. I think, let me just offer, sort of three broad lessons. I think the first one was really, throughout Libya's history after the 2011 revolution, unrealistic expectations that these various political milestones would by themselves produce enough consensus and legitimacy to start SSR from the top down at a nationwide level. And, we've seen this time and time again. Remember the National Transitional Council in 2011, there were people that thought, well, if they just decree that the revolutionaries should put down their arms, that will be enough. Then, of course, we thought that, well, the fall of the Qaddafi regime would be enough, that, well, there's no longer a reason to carry arms. That didn't pan out. Then the most important one was the 2012 elections, for the GNC, where people thought the elections by themselves would produce enough consensus and legitimacy to start SSR. That, of course, did not work. Those elections, produced more factionalism. They became a vehicle for more contestation in the security sector. The Ssr agreement of 2015, again, deferred very important discussions on the security sector because it was seen as too contentious. So you're kicking that can down the road. And of course, those unresolved issues about ownership of the security sector came back to bite us with the resumption of hostilities later on. And of course, we're now facing this milestone again with the elections and, enormous hopes. There's no plan B. And so that's why I like the focus of this study, which is let's not pin all of our hopes on that milestone, but let's engage in, shaping mechanisms on the side. I think the broader problem is there's no constitutionally mandated authority to regulate and oversee the use of armed force in Libya. And so the Constitution, when I talk to armed groups, they're often talking about a constitution, and that makes sense, right? To regulate the use of armed force. And absent that sort of, rules of the game, you're going to have continued contestation. Let me get to the second lesson, and that's, provocatively, first, do no harm. It's often hard to tell policymakers, especially, officials, you have a 2-year tour of duty at your embassy or you're a desk officer. I'm going to start something. I'm going to start this initiative to do a train and equip because I need to have a good performance report. We've seen this time and time again where these well-meaning initiatives start. We're going to do some train and equip. We're going to do a workshop. In the worst case, it's a waste of time, a waste of money. In the worst case scenario is it basically empowers armed groups. You've created more destabilization. And so the issue here is this impulse to train and equip, right? And we've seen these grandiose schemes time and time again, the 2013 General Purpose Force. And we can go into the how that failed, the Presidential Guard. All of these initiatives were undertaken prematurely before there was a real political consensus about security governance, about what it was going to look like. There was opposition from the militias. These initiatives were not married to a broader political process. So again, this sort of magical thinking that you're going to create from scratch a nonpartisan security force and drop it down in the middle of Libya, and it's going to be a stick against the militias. You're going to protect the government. Time and time again, this has not worked. Some other closing thoughts. I think this is often very difficult to address with policy tools, but focusing on the institutional capacity level, in terms of ministerial capacity, in terms of the management of the security sector, staffing, the bureaucracy, things like budget, procurement, personnel. This institutional capacity building dimension is so critical because we can engage in unit level train and equip, but unless there's a broader architecture for those units to fold under, you're just basically creating sort of more militiamen. So engaging at the institutional level, I think, is critical. It's something to think about. Obviously, Western states don't do that very well. We've tried it in Iraq and Afghanistan, but it's something to think about in the Libya context. And let me just close with a reiteration of something Tarek mentioned and that DCAF has already addressed, and that's the need to recognize and acknowledge the local and very hybrid nature of the security sector and try to work through it, right? Try to harness it, try to regulate it. It's not going to be the best ideal situation, but you're really working with things as they are on the ground in terms of local security providers, a bottom-up approach, engaging with other actors who have influence on security providers, such as tribal notables, civil society, women, and really, reconceptualizing security from the bottom up. Again, this is a fine line between, you don't want to defer that too long. You're not trying to encourage, militia rule at the local level, but we've got to abandon these sort of grandiose Western frameworks where we're going to create a security architecture in our image and insert it in this environment that is completely different, that has its own dynamics and its own set of rules. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Fred. Well, actually, I really thank you for this valuable lessons learned from experience and from this analysis. And also for the reminder on finding the right path on and the realistic and adjusted to the needs approach to security sector reform. We will now give the floor to Mr. Matt Herbert, with the research manager, for the North African Sahel Observatory at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Matt, you provided a chapter on extractive resource protection and the challenge of reforming and supporting the petroleum facilities. So how do you analyze the current structure and deployment patterns of this PFG, and what would you say are the main obstacles to reform this force? What is the impact? So we saw that there's a strong impact on other sectors of hybridization in this force ability to operate under government authority, in particular since 2011, and what insight could you draw from this analysis for SSG, SSR, and decentralization or centralization debate for the protection of the key economic infrastructure?
Well, thank you very much, Cecile. Some excellent questions that you provided to me there, and also thanks to Ahmad and Archie and Roberta for drawing this great group of people together. So first off, I'm going to perhaps go a little bit more complex on an excellent point that Fred just flagged, which is the need to address the national institutional level, which is 100% a key issue that is often lagging within the Libyan context. But I think it's also important to recognize that with the PFG and other hybridized forces, there's a real need to think about the local political angle when conceptualizing the realistic opportunities to further change. So I look at the issue of natural resource protection, and specifically the Petroleum Facilities Guard in Libya, or the PFG, as an important case to look at, not only because its dysfunctions have had a substantial economic impact on Libya, but because in its hybridity, it offers a microcosm of the challenges facing the broader SSR agenda within the country. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't start out by flagging that the movement towards reform of the force isn't resisted per se, at least not at the national level. As Ahmad flagged in a conversation we were having this morning, there's perhaps more agreement right now at the national level on the need for technical reform of the Petroleum Facilities Guard, given its not only apolitical, non-contentious need. Again, this is national. And thus the movement into a process for SSR, drawing in the various actors in Benghazi and Tripoli that seek to unify the divided force is really quite a possibility. And in this, there's actually the opportunity for an entry point to a broader process for SSR of the security and defense sector, but it's going to be difficult. Now, all that said, there are obstacles inevitably. And I think that it's important to dwell on them a little bit. The first point, unavoidably, is that the PFG at present is not one force. It's not even two forces as it's normally construed to be, divided between Benghazi and Tripoli. Rather, it's fractured with very tenuous command and control lines operating both to the forces in the field that are nominally falling under Benghazi and to the forces falling under the Tripoli command. So a reunification of the PFG commands in Tripoli and Benghazi is going to do little to affect how individual forces operate on the ground. And I think therein lies the crux of the issue. So the rapid expansion of the PFG since 2011 has really created an entirely new force. It's very separate in reach to what existed under Qaddafi. And because of the heavy hybridization that has allowed for its expansion, it's very heavily localized. So what we really need to keep in mind here is the issue is of interest alignment between communities in oil producing and oil shipping areas from whom a lot of the PFG field units are drawn, and the national governments, the national government that could come out, any other future divided governments that might emerge. Now, when these interests align between the national and the local level, there can be a mirage of a functioning command and control system and a unitary force that seems to operate. But as soon as those interests diverge, either on oil or on other issues, political, economic, social, the field units really start to go their own way. That mirage dissipates and they start to operate largely according to the local focus. So the local needs trump national commands. Now, this issue of challenges in interest alignment isn't likely to dissipate even if the 5+5 produces an agreement towards reunification. And this really underscores that, as in most security sector reform, the issue at play here and the bar moving forward is really fundamentally political. However, it's not the politics that we see coming out of Libya, either through the Libyan Dialogue Forum, national election issues, any of that. Rather, the issues are politics at the subnational and really at the local level. In many cases, linking as they do to questions around research federalism. So really what's needed to start the process towards reform is starting to have that discussion on the micro-local politics. Starting to talk very inclusively and very actively around equitable access to profits from the petrocarbon sector, especially for communities that are in marginalized areas that have few other opportunities, save for their proximity to production fields. Now, the second challenge that I'd flag is that we cannot and should not consider the PFG as a force operating in a silo. It was designed to operate as part of a constellation of security forces, an issue that's even more important now than ever before, given the highly militarized scene within Libya. And given this need, the potential for PFG reform as an entry point for broader security and defense sector reform is quite important. We need to start thinking about how to address all of these forces effectively simultaneously, or at least devising a process that doesn't seek to advance some up too far above others. Now, third, I think we need to think more about what mandate the PFG has and whether it can be expanded. So what I mean by this is that the PFG operating, especially in rural areas, is in some cases one of the larger security providers in those marginalized areas. And so starting to think about how the PFG can operate off of oil production sites, can start to supplement and provide support to other security and defense units that are operating in these areas, and do so in a way that falls within existent mandates rather than freelancing, I think is highly salient. Now, to do this, and I think that this gets to Fred's point, we need to start to think about whether the force needs to be rehoused, needs to be moved from the MOD to the MOI, whether there's a utility in starting to think this through as a more pure security force rather than defense force. Now, to follow up with everybody else and being a little bit provocative for my final points, I think that at a broader level, we need to start to conceptualize two SSR processes going forward. One which is optimistic and one which is pessimistic. And the one that's pessimistic recognizes that what is externally perceived of as instability is often remarkably stable. And Libya's instability, in part because of its oil resources, is more stable than most. So in an optimistic scenario for SSR, this is what we're here talking about. This is what's being planned out at the 5+5. In 10 years, elections have succeeded. There's been a move towards reunification, stabilization efforts get hammered out, issues of security force hybridity start to dissipate into the past. Essentially, the PFG moves towards reform as a unified force that's able to fulfill all aspects of its current mandate, as well as potentially anything else that gets put on its plate. Now there's the pessimistic process, and this is obviously darker. And that is, in 10 years, we're still having the same conversation that we're having today. The country remains fractious with a hybridized security and defense sector, which is not cohesive. Now, approaching this, we need to start to think about what happens if the PFG can't coalesce and remains more of a collection of field units. And I think in this planning, we need to think hard about what the basic level of security is that's necessary to keep the petrocarbon economy running. And that survival level of reform dictates a series of steps which we need to start to map out and think how to get implemented, again, at a survival level. Now, hopefully the optimistic process is what goes forward. And we're not having this conversation in 10 years, but I think we need to be prepared for all outcomes on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt, for this provocative or thought-provoking concepts. Well, let's be a bit optimistic on that and hope that we won't have the same discussion and the same conversation in 10 years. And at least the paper provided some ideas and concepts to find solutions. So I will now leave the floor to my colleague Roberta Maggi, which is a junior project officer at DCAF, and a co-editor of this volume for a couple of conclusions and remarks.
Thanks a lot, Cécile. It's been really wonderful to hear from all of the authors and experts, and I hope that the audience joins me in thanking them for both their presentations and their excellent chapters, including Inga, who unfortunately couldn't be here with us today, but wrote an excellent chapter about elections, which, you know, in this time is worth reading, especially. I'm conscious of time and of the need to move quickly on to the most interesting portion of this event, which is the Q&A. So I'm going to try to keep my remarks on the main conclusions of the edited volume a little bit short. The publication was written to respond to a lack of, I would say, holistic and contextually informed doctrinal approaches to SSR in hybrid environments, and especially in Libya, but also I would say in an effort to bring the practitioner community possibly one step closer to developing a concrete and long-term vision for SSR in Libya. So overall, I would say that the edited volume's chapters, and this we identified in our concluding remarks, revealed that a move away from the blurred implementation of SSR and DDR doctrines, especially when improperly sequenced, has become a little bit of a necessity at this point. So the impetus that was put on security sector stabilization measures in the volume's first chapter, I would say provides an alternative way of framing the debate, because it's now evident that there is this need to focus on stabilizing the security sector when discussing interim security arrangements in particular. Archibald, Emadeddin, and I also encourage at the end of this volume that everyone attempts to look a little bit beyond the upcoming elections as the sort of pivotal moment in which everything will suddenly change and become feasible from an SSR perspective in Libya, because at the end of the day, the challenges which need to be overcome before that happens are still numerous, even when there will be an elected body with a sort of legally valid mandate for implementation. I want to take a little bit of a moment here to commend the efforts made by Inga, Tarek, and Matt in tackling very innovatively some key themes of interest in the current Libyan context, and effectively showing that working on short-term challenges that are faced by the security sector could yield some almost immediate benefits. I would say by bringing about a form of stabilization that could directly affect the livelihood of the Libyan people. These chapters to me represent the very manifestation of the importance of exploring SSS further as a doctrinal approach, but also reflect a lot of what Fred was saying in his own chapter about the failures of DDR and SSR approaches so far this decade. What we noticed, and I'd like to stress this as I slowly start to bring this presentation to an end, is that at this particular point in time, the fundamental pillars of holistic SSR are not spelled out in SSR plans or visions that are being developed, and that's valid for both national and international level. What I mean by this is that a clear definition of what SSR is and should be is just absent from the security track in Libya, regardless of whether these elections actually take place or not. This is notably discussed in our concluding remarks with a reference to the Libyan Political Agreement, Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, and 5+5. And I would say this has concrete impacts on the very act of security of service provision itself. So the volume as a whole shows that there's this need for practitioners' approaches to SSR in Libya to be flexible, adaptable, contextually relevant, and as a result, just frequently revisited. And so overall, and I'll end on this point, I would say that while the political and security landscape is not currently conducive to meaningful reform, adaptive SSR blueprints can be designed on the basis of certain small-scale security sector stabilization initiatives, especially in the transitional period. And this is, in my opinion, what the practitioner community should strive to contribute to. So thank you very much to you, Cécile, for moderating, to all the other panelists and all the attendees for attending this launch event, and I'm just looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Roberta. Yeah, we will start now with the question we have for the moment. Yeah, well, a good set of questions. The first one from Matthew Joyner, what are the main obstacles facing the unification of military institutions in Libya, and what needs to be done to progress in creating solid institutions? Maybe Fred, you could answer that one.
Yeah, well, the framing of unification is problematic in some respects, in that there's a real, there's a real asymmetry between the two, sort of halves that we're talking about. And again, these are in some cases artificial and arbitrary as well, dividing the country into East and West. But, I think the Eastern part, especially as represented by the 5+5, they have there's a different concept of the state, about what the security institution is. And this, is the elephant in the room of the LNA. On the other side, it's much more diffuse. Of course, there are questions about the 5+5 or the officers representing the West, if they actually speak for those multiple, armed groups. And so I guess from a purely technical level, there are problems of representation and authority and constituency. But then, the broader problem of reunification is this definition of the state, of a social contract, about, it goes back to politics. And so, again, going to Matt's point, kicking this up to the national level is a recipe for failure. It opens up these big philosophical, political questions, whereas it's the discussions, it's the unification at the very micro level that really is what we're starting to see and that is happening. And I think that's a very important point that Matt made.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Well, the other question is for you, and might be also interesting for Emad, for instance, on this. The need to incorporate security sector governance and the governance of the institution hosting the authority into the Libyan constitution. Who could and should lead this endeavor, and how can support and movement be gathered for this fundamentally political effort. Hope the question is clear to you.
Still for you, Fred,
Ahmed.
by the way.
Oh, sorry, it's for me or for Ahmad?
Yeah.
For you.
Oh, sorry, it was on the Constitution? Because I didn't hear it quite clearly.
Sorry. The
No,
question is on
for-
the need to incorporate security sector governance and the governance of the institution hosting this authority into the Libyan constitution, and on the process who could and should lead this endeavor.
Well, no, that's such a tough question. I mean, no, I mean, look, there's been a long constitutional, process, and I don't have the easy answer for that. I mean, there's the constitutional drafting committee. My bottom line is that the security actors should have a role in this. They should have some input into this. And I think synchronizing this with political and economic tracks is key. I've talked to various security actors who think, again, the Constitution is absolutely critical, because without it, you're simply empowering another strongman. And, these armed groups, they want some check on the monopolization of force. So, and I've had other security actors tell me, look, the Constitution is just empty talk. We don't need it. So this is a very divisive issue, but I would just argue it needs to be integrated with all these other tracks.
Thank you. Maybe Ahmed, you'd like to say or so to answer partly to the question as well.
Sorry, briefly cut. Was that addressed to me?
Very briefly. It was addressed
Okay.
also to others.
Okay, well, I'll take it actually, because I had a few points to build on what Fred mentioned. I think one of the things that we sometimes forget is what the Constitution is supposed to represent, basically, for actual citizens. And given the fact that a lot of armed groups are actually, to a certain extent, expressions of what those local constituencies want, then that, yes, they should have a role, and the Constitution should actually technically not just come up with the contours or the relationship of what the armed forces and the military, let's say, would have in terms of vis-a-vis the civilian kind of oversight capacity, but also allow for that social contract to take place, in that you have a lot of various armed groups in Libya that are, to a certain extent, either representations of particular grievances or have co-opted particular grievances. And a lot of these grievances could be addressed, at least in theory, if not afterwards, in practice, through the Constitution in some way, shape, or form. So let's say, for instance, that we're talking about the Amazigh. A key grievance there is about introducing in the Constitution particular clauses that allow for their fair representation at different levels. If that is not addressed, that allows, or that will have a security effect, and that's what sometimes is forgotten within that framework. And that's what you get actually speaking to even people from the Jabal Nafusa or armed groups from the Jabal Nafusa. A lot of their grievances are related to that. And in fact, that's part of the reason why they mobilized in 2011 as well. They were one of the key pillars, I would say, in that revolution in particular. So that's what I think was also the missing link, partly in the drafting of the current Constitution. Not to say that it is completely flawed, but as Fred mentioned, I think that there should be an active role, let's say, in terms of taking stock of that in the constitutional making process vis-a-vis security sector reform.
Okay, thank you. Well, the next question is for Matt. Given the competition for resources and sometimes fractious relationship between MOD and MOI units, particularly in the South, is there an argument for the PFG to come under the Ministry of Oil and Gas or even the NOC?
Well, I think the NOC would certainly agitate for that. And in fact, Sanallah has in the past. I think the issue here is really short-term, long-term. So in the short term, there could be some benefit. I wouldn't necessarily say around the fractious inner engagement between MOI or MOD forces, especially in the South, so much as the primary issue that is motivating frustration within the ranks of the PFG, which is salaries. So the salary disbursement process right now is extremely complicated, with money only very slowly getting out to forces in the field, which in turn has led to instances of blockades and protests and other ramifications. So putting the PFG under the NOC to a degree would start to address the delays on salary disbursement. And that would be useful in the near term. Now, the problem is that sets up a complicated dynamic in the medium and long terms, especially around coordination. Like I said, the PFG is not meant to operate alone. It's meant to be part of a larger tableau of security and defense forces that are operating throughout the various areas of Libya that is deployed. And the more ministries, the more institutions that are housing different security and defense forces, the more complicated the ultimate issue of coordination becomes in the future. So while we might be solving an immediate problem by addressing the issue of salaries and frustrations there, we could be putting in place a much more problematic scenario further down the pike in Libya, or further down the line in Libya, where coordination is essentially impeded by the multiplicity of institutional housings of various forces that should be working together. So at this point in time, I think it's a point that should be discussed and debated, but I would say that thinking to the medium and long term now, and addressing and starting to think about kind of operational fixes to address the salary issue is probably a better approach than rehousing the PFG under the NOC.
Okay, thank you. Well, the next question is, I think, for Archibald to answer. On hybridity, this would be one of your favorite topics, on hybridity. And do you consider the current hybridity in Libya security sector as an obstacle to be overcome for the construction of a Weberian style nation state? Or is it also possible to consider hybridity as an opportunity to be taken stock of while exploring an alternative, the non-Weberian security governance model for Libya?
Well, yeah, I'm always very interested in hybridity, but I don't want to, take take all the information that I got from Ebad, who's been like or expert on hybridity. However, I think that we stated in the article that there was something that we want to keep in mind is that hybridity, I don't see it as a chance. I see it as a state of play. Why is that? Because hybridity is basically how we define the situation now. We see that there are multiple actors. We've been discussing with other researchers about what hybridity is. There are several factors to this, and we see that like in various various situations, not only in Libya. I mean, we see that also in Europe and elsewhere. However, I like to see hybridity as a transitional state, because hybridity also means that there is like a wide array of funding mechanisms when it comes to providing security. And these, the fact that there is like little oversight to funding mechanisms means that there is like a lack of transparency and responsibility and accountability. So to me, and I think that this is what Fred said a bit earlier, this is what we got. So we need to deal with it, we need to apprehend it, and we need to just like try and streamline more oversight and control in these mechanisms. However, I think that the model that we are still working with is a Weberian state with centralized use of force. Why? Because it is the most simple system for civilian oversight and transparency, the way we know it. So yeah, in a nutshell, but maybe Imad has a couple of points about it.
Yeah, I
No,
met, please.
no, I won't add much to Archie. I think the problematic facet of thinking about it as an obstacle is you either end up being reactive or rest in complacency. I think the past year has shown us that in this case, we've rested a bit in complacency. The momentum was not built upon afterwards. And in most SSR conversations, it was the beginning of the process or the engineering of the process or its design was viewed as too complicated. And therefore, I won't say the expedient solution, but the simplest solution was to kind of kick the can down the road and push for elections again, which is unfortunate because it's been tried and tested. But unfortunately, the institutional memory is just not there to remember that experience, I would say. And that's part of what we tried to tackle, particularly Fred tried to tackle in his chapter on maybe the short-sightedness of this approach. But yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Then the next question. I think you, Archie and Emad, so could answer that one. Basically, on the interest and priority of SSR and its compatibility with democratic reform in Libya, so considering the complex post-revolution history.
Okay, well, this is a question that I get in different forms, like for a long while now. It's about cultural relativism, essentially. That does security security provision is not more in certain situations when the situation is not ready. The security provision is more essential than individual freedom. I'm going to be a bit doctrinal here, and remind what the essentials of SSR are. Among those is transparency, a civilian oversight, rule of law, and protection, population-centered security provision. So, I mean, from experience, whenever you think that there is lack of crime, lack of when you observe a situation, a security situation, and you see that there is some lack of crime, so therefore the situation is assessed to be secure, and therefore you just imagine that the population is having a decent life, and therefore we can wait for the democratic principles to be implemented a bit later on in the process. From my own experience, I can say that it doesn't work like that. Effective security provision, the way we feel it, the way we encompass it, the way we intellectualize it, is basically based on democratic principles, and it's been tried elsewhere. I mean, I'm not going to bother everyone with experiences from different places. I guess it's a conversation we had with Fred in the past as well. There is no real security without the guarantee of individual freedoms. That is basically the bottom line. And if you advocate otherwise, that means that you're giving away so much that it is not real security. It's some form of oppression that is portrayed as security and stability.
Thank you. The next question, I think, we will sum up all the question in one. There's a series of questions, of course, on the pressing debate on the elections. So we will merge several of your questions, including several of the questions. So first of all, what are the main obstacles currently for successful and legitimate elections in Libya? There was also a question and a comment on also how to engage the police to secure the upcoming elections as well. And on SSR, DDR, and the importance, a comment on SSR and DDR, the fact that the political solution should be done before DDR and SSR. So if you could answer to this set of questions in a row. Ahmed?
Oh, it's for me. Okay.
Yeah, it
Well,
was
in
for
terms
you.
of
Sorry.
okay, no worries. So in terms of the electoral kind of timeline, I see several or multitude of issues of prerequisites. Well, a lot of which actually is tackled, let's say, in the study itself. But one main problem I would say is that I remember in 2018, 2019, the idea, well, in 2018 in particular, the idea of unifying Libya's military had a bit died down. It had garnered traction after the Ssr agreement. In theory, there was a dedicated track to kind of jump-start it, let's say, or unify it. But afterwards, it had died down. And 2020, and the end of the war, let's say, is what revived the idea of unifying the military, technically speaking. And that was at the, I would say, the height of that issue being the possibly the most contentious time for reviving it. So that was one of the main problems, I think, around which the security track in its entirety has been designed. And I think that's what also affected a lot of the other clauses in the ceasefire, because you couldn't unify the military, because the salient issues became the relationship of the military vis-a-vis civilian oversight institutions, or let's put it bluntly, the relationship of the LAF or Khalifa Haftar with the GNU or the MOD, etc., and that institutional kind of relationship not being resolved and being effectively skirted by the political track. That puts now the elections a bit in a place where they're designed not to resolve that issue, basically. So that issue will persist, regardless of who is elected, regardless of which president comes in. I think that's a problem that is just institutionally designed to persist at this stage. And that's without tackling anything about hybridity, without tackling anything about security management, without tackling anything about security provision, etc. I think one of the issues as well relates to the questions that was asked before about the kind of democratic principles and security provision, and that I think a problem that we have with the LAF in particular and the kind of model that is in the West that is inherently hybrid is that the LAF is a bit set up to predate upon itself, technically speaking, because of the way it is designed. Without the oversight component and without the civilian oversight component, that makes it very difficult for this institution to survive without a very precarious, I would say hereditary at this stage, succession process that I think most people know won't work. So it's an institution that is currently predating upon itself. Equally, on the Western side, I would say, not that there's an Eastern Western, that I don't want to delve into that stereotype, but the Western model, let's say, of localized structures is also unsustainable because it's not designed to also provide security, and it's just perpetually fluid. And we see that the legacies of kind of political process kicking down the road is just actually exacerbating those issues. So that's one of the, I would say, two of the major issues that we have today is we need to regulate the relationship of the military with the civilian institution. Ideally, that would be resolved not exclusively with elections, but with an electoral process, which today we don't have effectively, I would say, or don't have solid enough to resolve those issues. And then we also need a blueprint that is adapted to the Libyan landscape. Therefore, it takes into account, well, the existence of the LAAF and the existence of this decentralized model in the West. The solution could be a dual military. The solution could be something else entirely, but there needs to be a solution that is adaptable to the Libyan landscape, and that also leads to this Weberian style approach without the blueprint being designed at inception to feed into that right away. And yeah, sorry for the abstract answer, but I think that's what we're dealing with here.
Thank you. That's a comprehensive answer as well. The next question for Matt, please. There's an interesting question of interest for you on the involvement. We know that the involvement and participation of communities is crucial in any SSR process. How do you ensure the involvement, this involvement, and at the same time, the safety of communities in such a complex environment?
Yeah, especially in situations of acute insecurity and where things are changing, I think it's a particular challenge. So I'd start out by saying that we need to conceptualize community policing or support of the communities for security as essential. You know, you can't have security as imposed from above, and that's not just a comment point on democracy versus autocracy. That's just talking an operational reality. If you have a substantial disconnect between security force officials and communities, then there's always going to be a competition between them, and the raw effectiveness of security forces is essentially going to be substantially limited. So within this, I'd actually go back to an earlier question around, you know, is democracy and SSR compatible or incompatible? I'd say that actually democratic policing is really one of the only avenues out of the hybridity situation that we find ourselves in Libya. Unless you have communities that are trusting of security forces, they're simply not going to withdraw their support from the hybridized structures as exist today. The second point that I'd put out there is the question of security for whom. And I think traditionally in regimes across not just North Africa, but it's been particularly apparent there, security has been construed as security for the regime. Whereas there needs to be not just a rhetorical switch to security for the people, but actually an operational switch to the degree that communities actually really believe that, really interpolate that. And I think as part of that, we need to be conscious that even in these scenarios in which hybridized structures are providing some degree of community security, there are winners and there are losers. Now, we tend to focus a lot on the winners. We tend to focus on who's doing well out of these hybridized structures, what it's enabling, how it's providing power to specific individuals or tribes. We also need to be conscious of the losers, and we need to figure out how to approach these hybridized structures and approach the issue of advancing security sector reform in hybridized units, you know, with an eye towards how to protect those people that are either losing position or are at risk of either violence, social, physical, economic, being perpetrated upon them, and really think through that in really a micro local context. Now, this is obviously not something that's going to be easy to do or quick, but at the same time, you know, there's no option but to bridge the divide between security forces and the community. So, I mean, we need to go ahead and conceptualize novel ways to do that. And I could get into a very technical series of opportunities for doing so, but we're getting late tonight, so I'll leave it there.
Yeah, we still have 2 questions, and thank you. Well, we'd be interested into further technical details, but for another session. The 2 actually coming, the 2 other questions, probably the 2 last question would be answered quite well by Fred, I think, on the sort of ideal setup for security provision. So first of all, a question, should the Libyan constitution explain the details of security sector reform, and is that possible? shall the constitution consider limiting the powers of the executive to security agencies, particularly during a state of emergency? This was the first question. And the other one is between a question and a comment on the need to build a National Security Council to coordinate the efforts between the different units. Thank you, Fred.
Yeah. So I mean, these are great questions, and I mean, they've been proposed before. I mean, in 2013, UNSMIL had a white paper that they presented, and there was a proposals for a broader architecture. There was a proposal for a National Security Council to coordinate the functions. So again, I mean, I think these things exist in a theoretical level. They are on the shelf. I mean, these plans are there. The challenge has always been one of implementation and political will and political consensus on the part of Libyans, right? And I think regarding a constitution, again, going back to what was already discussed, this is really a fundamental foundational document for the nature of the Libyan state. And I think here it's very critical to empowering local governments, decentralization. And so the type of security architecture you're going to have will flow from the Constitution, which will not only regulate the management of force and civilian oversight and limit executive authority, but it will define the nature of governance throughout the state in terms of, are we talking about provinces, municipalities, sort of the broader structure. And I think that's where the security sector should fold into. Imad raised the issue of a dual military, and I think de facto, Libya is progressing on the ground towards some sort of architecture that resembles very localized security providers that are anchored in their territories and their communities, that are tethered to a central authority. And the Constitution, I think, would formalize that. It would harness that. It would help regulate that. Again, I guess those are my kind of thoughts. And just to echo what was said at a sort of philosophical level, we're really talking about ensuring that security provision is a public good and not a private good. And I agree, hybridity can be problematic at the local level because certain local actors are not going to be part of that public good, right? They're going to be shut out. And so the question is, we as an international community, what kind of tools do we have to regulate and sort of manage the security provision at the local level to ensure that doesn't happen? It's a huge challenge. I mean, because as was stated earlier, we're used to dealing with centralized governments. We're used to dealing with uniformed actors, right? And this, I think I'll just close on this, but I think it behooves diplomats and officials to think more creatively about the line between the state on the one hand and then, quote, militias. And we still have this normative construct where state good, militias bad, where what DCAF and others have been saying is, that train has left the station, right? It's so blurred now, and we got to work with what's on the ground.
Thank you. Ahmed, you had raised your hand at a certain stage. Maybe it was a mistake, or maybe you have something to complement.
No, it wasn't a mistake, but I don't think we have I don't think we have enough time.
No.
But I'll make it quite quick.
Very quick.
Yes, very, very quick. I think one of the issues that we have in Libya is also, to end on a provocative note, is that there's no dedicated security track, basically, and that's a problem. So ultimately, the security track is tied to a political track, which is unfortunately designed on a year-by-year basis, because the UNSMIL mandate is renewed on a year-by-year basis, which makes it very difficult to engineer something which looks like long-term, which also we tried to tackle through this publication in a way, at least have something that is workable short-term, stabilize something short-term. And that is also leading to a lot of the bilateral initiatives that we see by states. Unfortunately, we're lacking today a state or states that are not intervening in Libya. Almost all of them are, which makes any effort, even of mediation, quite political in and of itself. And that's part of what we're dealing with today. But hopefully we tried to shed some answers in the publication. I know it's not a complete resolution of the puzzle, but hopefully it's an effort that will continue to build on. And thank you, yeah. And I'd like to thank again all the contributing authors and my colleagues at DCAF and those listening for having been with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ahmed. So with that, and despite two interesting questions, still we're on time to close and to conclude this launch event for this edited volume. I would refer to all other persons interested in security sector reform in Libya to go back to this edited volume, which will provide you with some information on that important topic. And also, there's a question, question of Mrs. Bakeni on journalists on their role in security sector reform. Mrs. Bakeni, I would invite you to contact the Libya team, maybe, to answer this question, which they will happily do. I think it's a bit probably that would raise too many questions for this session. So I'd like first of all to thank all the attendants, all the participants to this event. Would like, of course, to thank the interpreter for having provided simultaneous interpretation during nearly 2 hours, an hour and a half, and all these distinguished panelists for the interesting insights and views and concepts and the very not provocative, but very thought-provoking and interesting events. Thank you all. And hopefully we will meet before the pessimistic 10 years to discuss hopes and perspectives for security sector reform in Libya. Thank you all.